Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special 5x15 event with WritersMosaic. WritersMosaic is a division of the Royal Literary Fund and an online platform that celebrates the multiplicity of perspectives, the energy, the unpredictability, and the global reach of new UK literature. It offers a new way of looking at writers and writing in the UK, and we're so pleased tonight to present our second collaboration with WritersMosaic after the success of our first event together last February. A very special thanks to Colin Grant, director, and Gabriel Badamosi, a founding editor of WritersMosaic, for making connections and for making tonight possible. Tonight's event marks the publication of a special edition of WritersMosaic on the subject of Jewish multiculturalism, in which authors look beyond predictable and divisive stereotypes to address questions around British society and multiculturalism from a Jewish perspective. It's thus our pleasure to bring together 5 brilliant writers and thinkers this evening for stories about heritage and identity. Another huge thanks must go to our first speaker tonight, Simon Liebesny, who is in fact the guest editor of this issue and has so brilliantly curated this evening's event. Simon is a freelance editor and publishing consultant, and he spent many years as first mate at Pluto Press, the radical publisher. And in a previous incarnation, he was also organiser and trustee of International Jazz Day. He's now an associate publisher at Saki Books at the Westbourne Press. We're so pleased to have him with us tonight. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, for that excellent introduction. We have an evening of really wonderful writers ahead of us. I am your entree, and I apologize that it is a virtual event, so I'm afraid you're going to have to make the canapes yourselves. Next time, I hope we'll be live and we can actually speak about things and have a bar as well. So this is my piece. Please enjoy. My mum came from a fairly religious family. My dad didn't. He showed my mum how to cook a ham. There was a bone of contention even before my older brother and I came into the world. At my mum's funeral in the burial chapel, the officiating rabbi solemnly declared that she was descended from a revered rabbi who lived around 400 years ago. Suddenly, a number of people my brother and I didn't know from Adam wanted to shake our hands unsteadily keeping our unfamiliar kippas, our head coverings, from falling off. They knew we weren't religious. They could be spotted a mile off, from the way we walked, from the fumbling around for our kippas. I felt humbled and a little bit embarrassed. Here are good people paying homage to an ancestor I was only dimly aware of. And I felt odd. I felt I'm not a part of this, and yet inevitably I am as well. And my parents had sent us to a Jewish primary school, so I could read very well from right to left. I still can. Still can't understand what I can read so very well. I still know the tunes from the synagogue service. I can still mumble along to them. It's reflexive in so many ways. And there are thousands like me, some very connected with all of that, some true enthusiasts, others far removed, yet still with an umbilical cord to the mothership, the Jewish mothership. The United Synagogue, which is one branch of the Jewish community tree, but claims to speak for all Jews in the equally United Kingdom, launched an initiative to retain and reclaim young Jews to the faith, stop losing them to atheism or indifference and football. They called it tribe. Now, tribe is a contested and a debated term. When you call yourself tribe, you run the risk of perpetuating certain stereotypes and prejudices. It suggests a distinct social group, part of, and yet not part of, the wider community. There is one area of tension between Jewish and multiculturalism, itself a highly contested and debated term. For centuries, Jewish communities have been part of the warp and weft of everyday life in the hundreds of countries in which they've settled. Not only merchants and bankers, as certain insidious racists like to portray all Jews, the Jews, they control our lives. But they are bakers, they're nurses, they're cab drivers, they're social workers, carpenters, teachers, market put, you name it. They drink, they gamble, they swear, they tell good jokes, they tell cringeworthy jokes as well. It's funny how real people seem to be forgotten when some narcissist bigot wants to provoke hatred. Even famous people given airtime to inform us that anti-Semitism is on the rise again, which I do not dispute, tend to focus on other famous people who've encountered anti-Semitism. So opportunity knocks and then it gets kicked into touch. So what about the M word, multiculturalism? Well, Zadie Smith, a wonderful writer from Willesden, my manor, stated, it's not some great project with a capital P. It's something we experience in our everyday lives. We do it without a primer. To a large extent, this is all true. After all, if you go around thinking, this is multiculturalism, this is what it's all about, then to quote WritersMosaic's very own John Siddiq, you're just adding a big dollop of ego. What is strange, though, is that those who want to divide and rule are the ones who spout on that the multiculturalism project has failed, as if the powers that be have created some kind of behavioral sink. They sat back and observed whether they had thrived or strived or tribed. For the writer, faced with those conflicts and contradictions, do they wring their hands? Do they go around asking, well, how did I get here? Or do they give up? Well, WritersMosaic quotes the author and stand-up Archie Maddox. All creativity comes from some sort of fight, fighting to express yourself, fighting to understand the world around you, fighting to be heard. For writers who are Jewish, which is as much freer description than Jewish writer, the fight is ever present. How not to write about what you're expected to, how to be yourself and not subservient to the views of others. How do you write and not be identified and even vilified as being the wrong kind of Jew? Right now, a very popular writer who happens to be Jewish has been effectively barred from appearances at Jewish cultural events and venues. And why? All down to an absurd and also tragic set of circumstances not of their making. They are unsafe. As a writer, you could be guilty of crimes you never committed. And the irony, one of the many ironies, is that this makes for a tragicomic story. And now that Kafka's no longer around, somebody should write it. So being brought up with the fear of transgression becomes an open temptation to do exactly that, to transgress. Writers do it, for that's part of their existence. Writers who are Jewish possibly specialize in transgression because there are so many boundaries to break. There's the wrath of a jealous God. There's the rejection of your community, wherever that might be. There are political, religious, social, cultural rules, conditions, nuances to break. Look for a pillar of fire, and there you'll find a writer. Now, the other wonderful people in this broadcast tonight are all writers. They're bloody good writers. They're explainers, illuminators, mystifiers, tricksters to be trusted, pricking veins with the writer's needle. Me? Well, I'm not a writer, unless you include the stuff written on buses or trains and these days kept in folders marked miscellaneous. I can't call myself a writer. It's like visiting Paris and saying I've been to France. I edit a bit, the writer's nemesis. I'm the let's cut those 10,000 words, shall we, kind of guy. The let's lose the episode in the laundrette. It doesn't really advance the story sort of guy. It may be hard to write, but sometimes it's hard not to write, paralyzed by so much great and good writing that's around you. And sometimes it's harder not to tell a story than to tell it, which goes back to my dad, he of the ham. He escaped from Vienna a few weeks after he turned 18. That was July 1939. He was interned on the Isle of Man and then sent off on an overcrowded ship, survived being torpedoed by U-boats, as well as beatings, abuse, and inhumane treatment by British soldiers. 2,500 detainees on a ship built for half that number. They weren't even told they were headed for Australia. Did he tell his story? My dad didn't even tell us, his family. I only found it out when I discovered a notebook hidden in the back of a chest of drawers. And that was 36 years after he died. He kept his story to himself and blocked out the past. He chose not to. Some stories just resist. And writers who are Jewish are bound up with the past. The collective tragedies of early generations cast giant shadows over everything. So can you be a writer and not write about this? Or where can you transgress? One of the transgressors was a hero of my student days, was Michael Horowitz. He was a beat poet and a little bit batshit crazy. He was responsible, or irresponsible, for the Poetry Olympics, a series of events in the early 1980s which brought poets into places like the Roundhouse and even Westminster Abbey. I fell in love there, with Linton Kwesi Johnson, with Fran Landesman, James Berry, Liz Lockhead, John Cooper Clarke, so many more. I saw Michael Smith, one of the great dub poets, sadly murdered a year later for being a thorn in somebody's side. But here was something special, a great celebration of multiculturalism. So great it couldn't possibly last. Maybe it was a middle-class, self-indulgent culture fest, another great big dollop of ego. But you can write about Jewish multiculturalism without being trapped by the past, or being trapped by questions of identity for that matter. In this, Jewish people aren't alone. In his Granter essay, which became the new book, I'm Black So You Don't Have to Be, Colin Grant of this parish, WritersMosaic, asks, can the Black author really write out of their colour? In writing about Black characters, can they ever escape race? When I worked at the Kilburn Bookshop, the High Road hosted this huge graffiti, letters that read, "Remember 1690." I prefer to think of more recent times. The Battle of Cable Street, for example, when the Irish and the Jewish in the East End of London came together to stop the fascist black shirts. Look up on WritersMosaic, the wonderful essay by Rachel Lichtenstein. Look up Eva Hoffman, who wrote about Jewish and Polish multiculturalism that thrived between the wars. In both cases, though, we know what happened next. Now, many people in the UK, many Jewish people, are more comfortable and they're more middle class than they were. Have they retreated? Have they become somehow afraid of the great experiment, the great project, in case it deprives them of something? Perhaps the fear of losing that hard-earned safety and stability. The fear maybe of having to pack and leave, the story of the last 100 years for so many Jewish people. Some have, quite possibly, but the great majority in their daily lives are immersed with the communities in which they live and which they work. They are the cabbies, the doctors, the teachers, the artists, and the writers. And those include writers who not only embrace the distinctiveness of our many communities, but also the differences and the distinctions within their own. There are the Sephardi Jews, originally from Spain and Portugal, the Mizrahi Jews from all points in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Their literature, their sensibilities, their cuisines are also very different from what most people think as Jewish. But their voices aren't heard often enough. They're seldom portrayed in books or on screen. Their creative fight, and for that matter, their flight, is central to being Jewish and absolutely front and center to Jewish multiculturalism. WritersMosaic gives good advice here. It says, find out your own voice, write to transform the labels, find out the story that people don't know, the one that opens a space for you to talk. And for me, in those words, I find myself a space which allows me to be proud of an identity which doesn't need to be labeled by others, which resists all the trappings of definition to be itself. And not least, I find myself humble in the memory of my mother. who allowed my brother and me to find out for ourselves who we might want to be. To finish, there is a certain narcissist, shithead, can I say that? I just did, who I shall not name. I mean, there are so many of them. But this is the one who threatened to go DEFCON 3 on the Jews. Now, it's odd, because one of the major sponsors of this narcissist sells running wear. And all the way from Cain to Yossarian, Jews have always been running. The sponsor's tagline is one that we all know, we're all familiar with it. It's a tagline that celebrates multiculturalism. Just do it. Thank you.
Well, that's an incredibly tough act to follow. So I'm going to do my best. I can't guarantee I'll be as articulate and deliver it as well as Simon did. Okay. I first heard about Jewish people at school in religious education classes. I'd always had an interest in different cultures and different religions, and I remember learning about what a bar and bat mitzvah was at primary school. I was really little, and they also taught things like Islam's pillars of the faith. And I'm not sure when I found out that I actually had Jewish ancestry, but it was one of those conversations that would just recurrently come up with my dad, where he'd say, you know, we've got Jamaican Jewish ancestry on our family side, and I'd always be curious as to, you know, what that meant. And I didn't have a Jewish upbringing at all. In fact, you know, I come from a Jamaican family, there's a lot of Pentecostalism in my family, and I was sent to a Catholic school when I was a child for the first years of my life, because it was a better school. I was Christian Catholic, but not because my family's Catholic. But again, my upbringing was very much not Jewish. So, you know, where I've ended up today and how I've managed to feel at home is quite an interesting journey for me to kind of think about. So I'm originally from Birmingham, even though my accent has gone quite a lot. And there weren't a lot of Jews in Birmingham. So I didn't really come across many. There are some in Edgbaston, and there's a lot of Jewish people at Birmingham University, students, but I didn't really come across any at secondary school or sixth form or primary school. So when I went to university, I started at Cambridge. That's when I really started to meet Jewish people. I would be invited to Jewish events and had lots of Jewish friends. And I remember going to a Hanukkah party with my friend and dancing and just feeling strangely at home in a way that was hard to articulate. And I was obviously acutely aware that I had this ancestry on my Jamaican side of this kind of Jewish heritage. And I'd always felt that something was missing in my spirituality. And so once I started, when I was at university, and I think it was around second year, I started reading about Judaism privately, about festivals, about practices, about prayers. I started fasting for Yom Kippur privately, because I was also aware that, you know, Judaism is an ancient religion, it's an ancient culture, and it wasn't something that I wanted to culturally appropriate or misunderstand. So I kept a lot of my explorations of Judaism to myself and didn't really share it with anybody else. And this was, I think, part of a broader time in my life where I was exploring my identity and what it meant to be me, where I came from. So obviously there was the Jewish element. I also did a lot of decolonization work at university, things like repatriating the Benin Bronze and learning about that part of my history. So at the risk of sounding incredibly cliched, it was a period of exploration, and, you know, where I've ended up with my faith arguably is one of the most life-changing things, because it's going to you know, inform who I marry and how I have children. But anyway, eventually I told my friends at university, you know, I really resonate with Judaism. This is who I feel like I am, and they were amazingly accepting and welcoming. And so I started going to JSOC and engaging with the community there, and became one of the kind of fitments at JSOC, and was always involved in the politics, as we all know, as Jews like to argue, and there were lots of arguments, and I was very much involved, so I felt very much at home. So I did that, and I began my conversion formally, and then I decided to go to Israel after university, study at the conservative yeshiva there, and that was one of the most informative formative spiritual experiences of my life. I still remember going down to the Kotel for Shacharit. You know, I think it was like, I'm not a morning person. It was like 6, 7 a.m. and the morning sun was hitting the egalitarian section of the Kotel. And I just remember thinking, I can't actually believe I'm here, that this is real. So it felt right. The entire time I was at yeshiva and davening and spending time in these Jewish places, I felt completely at home. And I remember being really sad that I had to leave. And then within a year, about just over a year later, I'd converted to Judaism formally after several years of considering it and then going through the motions and going to classes, etc. And then afterwards, you know, at the Bet Din, when you convert, they say to you, are you ready to experience anti-Semitism? We had a bit of a, not from the Bet Din, but broadly from society, and we had a bit of a chuckle, because obviously I'm black, so it's like I understand what racism is, probably different to a white person who is in an ethnic minority, converting to Judaism, has a different experience of racism, may not know what it feels like. Obviously I did, but it kind of took me by surprise in some ways as well, because obviously the British Jewish community is quite homogeneously white. So I noticed once I'd converted that I did stick out. And I think, you know, in a university environment where you've got all your friends, you're not as aware of that. But, you know, when I go to Jewish shops, or, you know, when I was out with my then boyfriend at the time, he would notice that people would stare at us or kind of cock their heads a little bit. Less so in places like, in Jewish places like Israel, because there was lots of different ethnicities there, which I'll go into later with the West African Ethiopian Jews. But you know, I noticed that I stood out. And, you know, when I go to synagogue, I get people stopping me at the doors asking, you know, too many questions. And sometimes I would just say, I know that I'm black, but I'm Jewish, are you going to let me in? So there was that sense that I started to realize that despite being Jewish, having the paperwork to prove it, I didn't feel fully Jewish. And I kind of wanted to understand that a little bit more. And I also realized after I converted that there would be a level of alienation as well from some of my fellow black people. You know, I got into an argument, the notorious Wiley, on his anti-Semitic rant. He happened to tell me that I wasn't truly black because I was Jewish. So there was all these things that were kind of milling around me emotionally when I converted, and I felt like I wasn't very grounded, and I felt like I needed to understand a bit more about being this kind of minority within a minority and being hyper visible, but then sometimes feeling erased. And even little things like, you know, being asked, how are you Jewish, in a way that white Jews wouldn't be asked, or how do you know Hebrew? All of these things started to make me feel, was I sure that I belonged? Was I at home in this community? So eventually I ended up going to Israel to record a documentary with the BBC called Black, Jewish and Proud. And I decided to go and talk to the world's biggest community of Black Jews, the Ethiopian community in Israel, based in Israel. And it was completely fascinating to me, because Israel, with respect to the Jewish population, is ethnically diverse. There's Mizrahim, there's Sephardim, there's Ashkenazim, there's just people that just see themselves as Israelis, and then there's also Ethiopian Jews, and then there's obviously other ethnic minorities there. And to see kind of this black population that had moved to Israel, fled a war, and to see how they fitted into that society was really fascinating to me. Particularly, you know, many of them told me they thought all Jews were black, because the Ethiopian community that came to Israel were quite isolated, and they were rescued by the Israeli government in the 80s, and they genuinely believed that, you know, they'd go to Israel, it would be a land of milk and honey, and everybody would be black because they didn't really have any technology. And I've actually got a quote here from one of the women I interviewed there, and she said, people were so innocent and naive about what it means to put everything behind you. This was Penina Aganyahu, who arrived to Israel at the age of 3. You have an image in your mind of arriving to Jerusalem, the Holy Land, a land of honey, milk and gold, where everyone is Jewish, where everyone is a black Jew. So this was really interesting to me, because obviously my experience of being a Jewish person in the UK was feeling kind of disjointed, but for black Ethiopian Jews before they arrived to Israel, being black and Jewish was all they ever knew. And that was quite eye-opening for me to kind of think about. But of course, being a black Jew anywhere in the world, being black anywhere in the world, being Jewish anywhere in the world, there can be difficult identities to straddle, and particularly in Israel. And one of the things I was told by Ethiopian Jews was they did experience hostility. They weren't necessarily welcomed. They had to prove their Jewishness. They had to explain their Jewishness. community leaders in because Ethiopian Judaism is different to how, you know, Ashkenazim practice or Sephardim practice. As everybody knows, everybody has their own minhag, everyone has their own traditions, and Ethiopian Jewish traditions had developed in isolation. So there was a battle as well to have that form of Judaism, that identity recognised by the state. And in a way, that's something that I felt I related to, insofar as I felt like I had to prove my Judaism on a regular basis. And so that was very, very eye-opening. And another thing that Penina told me was, when you get to understand you are the minority, it's hard, she said. I always say to my friends and colleagues, you can't really understand what it's like to be a minority from within a minority. You really can't. And that really resonated with me as well. And, you know, some of the battles I've had with people in the Black community and people in the Jewish community to understand what I go through. Again, it was a real learning experience. But also one of the things that I found was that I actually felt quite out of place at times, because, as I've mentioned, Ethiopian Judaism is completely different to everything that I'm familiar with. I converted to Judaism and live within an environment that is very Ashkenazi. The food that I eat on festivals, the songs that I sing in synagogue, the services that I recognise are all Ashkenazi. And what was really striking for me was, despite having this kind of commonality of this blackness, of this sense of marginalisation within the community, I also didn't know very much about them at all in terms of their practices. So on the Jewish festival of Sigd, I knew nothing about, you know, where it all came from, what it all meant. I don't know how to read Ge'ez, which is one of the languages, is an Ethiopic language that they use in their when they daven, and even words like davening, that's from Yiddish. So it was really interesting for me to kind of witness this sense of commonality, but also this sense of distance. And then I also, one of the things that struck me as well was the Ethiopian Jews would say to me, we want our practices, our customs, Sigd, to be incorporated into the Jewish calendar, which is something that Israel is doing. But again, it was that sense of trying to incorporate all of the kind of the different colours, different practices of Judaism under one umbrella and celebrate it equally. So again, there was just lots of kind of revelations I was having at various points when I was there. But of course, going back to the similarities, the social challenges that Ethiopian Jews faced, such as police brutality, which seems to be a story wherever Black people go in the world when it comes to treatment. For example, there was in 2019 there was an unarmed Black man called Salomon Teka who was killed by an off-duty policeman, which triggered protests across the country, and the officer was tried for negligent homicide. And there were certain themes which, outside of a religion, but also being Black, but also being Jewish, all of these things coming together, that I actually did resonate with. So I felt like I was in some ways being pulled in lots of different directions. And so that gave me a lot of food for thought about where I fitted in. And then when I came home, I reflected on everything that I'd learned. And I realized that, you know, being a Black Jew is a complicated existence. I think being a Jewish person in general is a complicated existence, because you have your identity of your nationality and where you are, but you also have this culture that people don't understand, or you may be discriminated against. And the same is true for Black people. You know, you have your Blackness, but you're also in a culture which may not respect that, or may not understand that, or may not treat you as an equal. So there were just so many moving parts. But the thing that I did take away from all of it was that Blackness and Jewishness are more than compatible. In fact, I genuinely believe that people of colour and any kind of person of colour's fight is a Jewish fight, because we are come in all shapes and sizes and colours and countries and cultures. So if anything, I felt more like I belonged, because the story of being Jewish is a diaspora one. It's of adapting to change. It's surviving in various countries despite everything. It's flourishing in the societies that you're in, regardless of your circumstances. So that really helped me kind of understand. And then when I came home, it made me think more about what I want to do next. So after that journey, you know, growing up in a predominantly Christian household, but not really practicing, to going to university, to finding I was Jewish, to converting to Judaism, to going to Israel. Now I'm at a stage. Sorry, am I running over? No. Now I'm at a stage where I feel like I'm ready to kind of go to Jamaica and find out more about myself. And I know that it's going to be at times a difficult journey, because, you know, there is a history of slavery in the Caribbean, and there will be Jewish involvement in that, as I've read about, but not as much as the kind of conspiracy theorists like to push. But there's going to be a lot for me to learn about myself. But I want to kind of bring it back to my own culture now, my own family, and I'm hoping this year to lead a Seder for Passover with them. So I think I may have run over. I meant to put a timer on, so I will finish off with saying, hopefully I didn't ramble too much. Thank you for listening and watching, and I hope it's been informative and that you've learned a little bit more about what it is to be a Black Jew.
Dean, thank you so much for that fascinating talk, and thank you, Simon, for kicking us off too. Our next speaker is Keith Kahn-Harris, a sociologist, writer, senior lecturer, and fellow of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. Keith has a broad range of interests and particular expertise in metal music scenes in the UK Jewish community. His career bridges academia and multiple other worlds, and he's the author of numerous articles, edited collections, and books, of which the most recent is What Does a Jew Look Like, in collaboration with Rob Stothard. Keith, thank you so much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I really shouldn't be here. If in my youth I had had more self-esteem, if I'd been tougher and surer of myself, I would never have become the sort of person who gets invited to give talks about what it is to be Jewish. I would never have worked for Jewish organizations, written books on Jewish themes, or in fact, married a rabbi. In short, I would never have become what we call a macher. A macher is an involved Jew, someone whose life is intrinsically intertwined with Jewish community, someone who has opinions and can sometimes be a bit of a pain in the ass. No, if I had more self-esteem, I would have walked long ago. And that's not because I wasn't interested in Judaism when I was growing up. It's because I was interested in Judaism when I was growing up. You see, if you were an adolescent in the 1980s Jewish community in which I grew up, an evident interest in Jewish history, Jewish religion, and Jewish culture was an unmistakable sign of not fitting in. Let me explain my adolescent predicament with a crude masculine heteronormative analogy that is, unfortunately, much too perfect not to use here. Imagine you found yourself a member of a club devoted to the appreciation of classic cars. Imagine that the club held regular meetings in which aficionados gathered to peruse the latest automobile publications. Now imagine that at the first meeting you attend, you find to your bafflement that while all of the publications did contain articles about classic cars, the majority of their pages consisted of photos of naked women in provocative poses. And imagine then that your fellow attendees at club meetings spend very little time actually discussing the automobiles, preferring instead to publicly pleasure themselves to Playboy, Mayfair, and the like. Can you imagine that? What would you do? Well, if you were me, you would loudly and publicly insist on your love of classic cars and pretend that this was actually the primary purpose of the meetings. And all the while inside, you would have wished you had the confidence to perform public autoeroticism. The Jewish youth movements in which I tried and failed to fit into during my 1980s adolescence were such erotic hothouses. And to pretend against all evidence that they were about what they were supposed to be about was the last faith-saving refuge of those of us who could not join the libidinous dance. The best bit of the Jewish summer camp I attended in the Netherlands in 1987 was the visit to Westerbork, the transit camp from which Dutch Jews were sent to Auschwitz, including Anne Frank. There wasn't much left of the camp, but the remains of the railway sidings, a rebuilt watchtower, and the woodland location all made for a somber memorial. And here, for a blissful hour or two, I had a legitimate excuse for not fitting into the social whirligig. My fellow campers performed a simulacra of solitary contemplation, all the while waiting impatiently for the orgy of flirtation to restart. I also performed silent reverence to the martyrs, while dreading the time when I would have to get back on the bus and everything would begin again. In that short period, no one could have outwardly told the difference between myself and the real human beings. As time stood suspended, we were joined in the hypocrisy of public piety. That camp was run by the Zionist youth movement Wrangler, and while they do have a Dutch branch, this camp was for British Jewish teens like myself. It was the fourth and final time I attended summer camp, although my first with Wrangler, This time, my habit of insisting that a wank mag was a classic car magazine finally became untenable. I was always one of the kids that the Madrachim, that is to say the youth leaders, a few years older than myself, loved. I threw myself into the programs they put on, the inventive ways they helped us learn about and discover what it was to be Jewish. Above all, I bought into the idealism and passion which they brought to Jewish life. And it wasn't entirely a lie on my part. British Jewish youth movements, then and now, are engines for British Jewish vitality and often provide the peak experiences that engender a lifetime of Jewish belonging. They aren't what they seem, though, or rather, they aren't entirely what they seem. Recently, the anti-Semitic conspiracist David Miller took aim at Habanim, arguing that they groom and radicalize Jewish children into supporting Zionism. He pointed to David Baddiel and Sacha Baron Cohen's membership of Habanim and their track records of what he calls racist comedy. The person circled in that picture is Sacha Baron Cohen as a teen in Habanim. Miller also pointed to my old school, Haberdashers' Asks Elstree, which Baddiel and Baron Cohen also attended, as well as Matt Lucas and other British Jewish comedy luminaries. My adolescent milieu was apparently a hothouse of racist indoctrination. Now imagine thinking that Jewish youth movements are actually about Zionism and Judaism. Imagine thinking that Jewish youth culture had a purpose beyond erotic self-perpetuation. In fairness to Miller, it's a delusion shared by many of the people who run Jewish youth movements and those who fund them. It was certainly a delusion shared by my parents and I. We thought I would fit into Habanim because the movement was ideologically socialist Zionist, and I too was left-wing. Am I being too harsh here? Well, if I was writing with my sociologist hat on, I would never make such sweeping generalizations. Habanim might not be representative of all Jewish youth movements then and now, and perhaps those who stayed in the movement past the point that I dropped out became more ideologically motivated. I do know this, though. At least at the age of 15, at least in Habanim, there was no social capital available for those like me who showed too much interest in the educational content. No, that would have missed the whole point of what the thing was about. What was it about then? It was certainly about flirtation and copping off. It was certainly about performance and extroversion. It was certainly about being social and valuing banter above all things. This was a social system in which the currency of success was verbal brilliance and the ability to strum an acoustic guitar. But really, then as now, I could never put my finger on what it was to be a Habanim person or a Jewish youth movement person. There was something unnameable, something ingrained in the subculture that excluded me. All I know is that for 2 weeks in the Netherlands in 1987, I was frozen. I couldn't connect. The two friends I went with managed it, but I couldn't. I cried in the toilets. I yearned for suicide. One night I took 4 paracetamols, but my roommates just laughed. I gazed at the road outside our youth hostel and felt crushed at my inability to jump in front of a car. Lacking the courage to kill myself, I was forced into loudly proclaiming the quality of the articles about classic cars. I shone in discussion groups. My earnestness was catnip to the Madrachim and irrelevant to my peers. I performed lamentations for the 6 million just to make myself feel very slightly better. I also ended up bullying the only one lower down on the social scale from me. He had braces, ones that dominated the mouth. He was awkward and gawky. Every time I saw him, I quipped, that flashing glint of steel. Me, I was too redundant to even be worth bullying. On the last night, as always happened, things changed. My friend and I performed a skit at the closing camp show. At the top of the social hierarchy at the camp were 2 kids from Glasgow who had completely bought into the then current popularity of the Beastie Boys, completely failing to get their irony. The kids repeatedly blared out their songs on a boombox, particularly one song called Girls. And on stage, my friend and I performed the song with new words. We ended with the following biting satire. Crap in our records, crap in our music, crap, crap, crap. Somehow it all went down a storm, yet it was too late, of course. I remained frozen, even if my reputation had risen a bit. Yet somehow I'm here, a professional Jew. It did get better. I found my place. I found my people. The route that brought me back is too long and complicated to recount here, but the first step was a stubbornness born of low self-esteem. I've always been the opposite of Groucho Marx. I always want to join clubs that wouldn't have me as a member. And however fucked up that sometimes may be, in the case of the Jewish club, it's an attitude that I'm proud of. We Jews have over 3,000 years of history. We have lived under despotism, feudalism, communism, capitalism, and democracy. We are and have been Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, and many other things. We are Zionist, anti-Zionist, secular, religious, and everything else you could imagine. In that deep and broad history, any one Jewish community and subculture is just a transient thing. To resign my membership from the Jewish people just because I didn't like 1980s British Jewish youth culture would be an act of historical myopia. The social hierarchies at Habanim camp in 1987 mean nothing in the flow of Jewish time. It's ironic, really. My feeling that something was wrong with me led me to stick around the Jewish world after what was the single most miserable experience of my life, and it remains the single most experience of my life. But by sticking around, I eventually became the kind of Jew I wanted to be, part of a community that I've learned to adore. I'm going to end by pushing an already dubious metaphor even further. Yes, I know it is heavily gendered and heteronormative, but, well, let's just say it. Nowadays, no one needs to pretend to read porn mags for the articles on classic cars. You go straight to the source, online most of the time. Porn is porn, classic cars are classic cars. Maybe amidst the brutality of our social media-fueled world, there is the possibility of choice and a liberating honesty. I met my wife at Limud, which, if you don't know it, is a large Jewish conference run every year over the Christmas season. Limud has taken a lot of elements from Jewish youth movement culture. Indeed, many of its leaders have been Madrachim, but there's one important difference. Limud is and was a place where Jews go to couple up. My wife and I are one of the many couples who succeeded. Yet if we never found each other, or indeed anybody else at Limud, it would still have been worthwhile going. Because Limud is also unapologetically a place of learning and exploration. One is not subordinate to the other. One is not an excuse for the other. Those who want porn, find porn. Those who want classic cars, find classic cars. And those of us who want both, find both. Let me stop sharing.
Keith, thank you so much for that. Our fourth speaker is Shelley Silas, who writes for theatre, radio, and television. Shelley's numerous plays for stage include Eating Ice Cream on Gaza Beach, Falling, and Mercy Fine, and her plays for Radio 4 include United Kingdoms, The Trial of the Well of Loneliness, and The Sound of Silence. She has worked in TV as a development producer, and her VR short, The Turning Forest, was selected for international film festivals. Her current work includes a new play for Rifco Theatre, and we're really pleased to welcome her here tonight. Shelley, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks to all the other speakers. It's really interesting to hear what you were saying. So I've spent a long time thinking about Jewish multiculturalism and what it means to me. I actually asked several friends and family members what they thought, and their responses were varied. Individuality, a shared ethics, a private approach to faith. My cousin calls himself an atheist Jew, and I would probably say I'm the same. My Jewishness being about customs and traditions rather than religious practice. However, I'm very aware that my Jewish identity is linked to my immediate family, my mum and dad, and my sister. My sister died 12 years ago, my dad 9 years ago, and my mum 2 weeks ago. What meaning does my Jewish identity hold for me now that my immediate family is dead? I have no children to pass on my traditions. Do those traditions end with me? It was really refreshing to read a short story called The Sephardi Survivor in The Man Who Sold Air in the Holy Land by Omer Friedlander, about two boys who need to find a Holocaust survivor to take to school for Holocaust Memorial Day. And the only elder they can find is a Sephardi. But what of the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews from the East? Where are we? We are here. I am here in front of you. I am a Calcutta-born Jew with Iraqi heritage. On the day I was born, there was a cow in the middle of the road. My parents were born in Kolkata. My dad moved to Jerusalem when he was 2. My mum arrived in post-war London in her early 20s. Mum's parents were born in Kolkata. Dad's were from Amara in Iraq and Penang in Malaysia, and other relatives from Aleppo in Syria. I'm tempted to have a DNA test to see whether I have any Eastern European heritage, but actually I'm not sure I want to know. I have green eyes, so did my mum, and my sister and dad blue-grey eyes. I'd often wonder what it would be like to discover that perhaps I'm not all I think I am. I call myself a Sephardi Jew because it's easier, because most people know about Sephardi Jews. But in reality, I am a Mizrahi Jew, a Jew from the East. One of my grandfather's part-owned a pickle factory. I enjoy telling this to people because I always feel the need to state that I am not part of the Raj, which is the go-to assumption that people make, or perhaps it's the assumption I make of others' assumptions about me being born in India. In my parents' generation, if an Ashkenazi married a Sephardi or Mizrahi Jew, it was seen as marrying out, marrying someone who was other to you, less than. Imagine that. I still joke about it on occasion. Conversely, when a Sephardi or Mizrahi Jew marries an Ashkenazi, mostly it's about how our food is so much more flavoursome. I apologise to all the Ashkenazis here. Buy any of Claudia Roden's Middle Eastern cookery books and a wealth of culture, history and food will overwhelm and tantalise you. Regarding the othering of Jews, several years ago, I was out with members of my family one evening when someone who I knew was sitting with us, and they commented, "Oh, you're all very exotic." My family found this insulting. Their dark skin and dark eyes and beards were seen as other, despite all of them being born in the UK. It made them and me feel othered. I've explained so many times to so many curious people that there are Jews from elsewhere than Europe, from the Middle East and North Africa. The B'nai Israel Jews in India kept their Jewish traditions while being very much part of the caste system. We're called the Wandering Jews for a reason. We are the forgotten Jews, the afterthought Jews. I was recently asked to contribute some work because somebody suddenly remembered that all the Jews who'd been invited were Ashkenazi. Quick, find a Sephardi or a Mizrahi Jew. I'm reminded of Edward Said's Orientalism and the sense of superiority the West had towards the East, the Orient, the other. This sense of other was apparent in the way Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews viewed Sephardi, Mizrahi and B'nai Israel communities. Excuse me. I've always been the wrong kind of Jew, having to squeeze my writer's voice in the predominantly Ashkenazi canon of writers, and non-Jews often don't know how to compartmentalize me. I tick all the boxes and no boxes. I belong everywhere and I belong nowhere. Living in 2023 London, Jewish multiculturalism is about living alongside the diverse traditions and practices of other Jews and accepting those differences. I cannot un-Jew myself unless I convert it to another religion, and I have no intention of doing so. The common ground I share with other Jews, whether Orthodox or secular, is anti-Semitism. I am a Jew inhabiting a multicultural society. A Jehovah's Witness once came to the house and, seeing the mezuzah on the front door, asked who the Jew was. I said, "Oh, that's me, and my wife is a Catholic Buddhist, and we're very well served, thank you." They walked away smiling because we had some belief. Our neighbours in southeast London are a mix of young white, elder Jamaican, Pakistani, Indian, Caribbean, and probably others from a cultural and ethnic background, others I do not know. I am a minority within a minority within a minority. I am a woman, I am gay, I'm a Mizrahi Jew within a majority Ashkenazi population. No one ever knows what to do with me, where to place me. But my Jewish identity, as I've said, is not about religion, but custom and tradition. The way we say our prayers, the tunes to our songs, and our food is a mix of Indian, Syrian, Iraqi cuisine, and in the past, some Malaysian food added to the mix. Recently at a writing workshop, the director said, I was more Indian than he was. He is brown. I am white. He was born in the UK. I wasn't. We were both brought up on Indian sweets, and I could name every single one of them. He said, Shelley, you could get an Indian passport where he could not. And apparently I'm allowed to buy property in India, which I'm not going to do. My most recent experience of Jewish multiculturalism was at my mother's funeral on Tuesday, the 17th of January. There in front of me were my aunt, born in Egypt to Greek and Egyptian parents, her daughter-in-law, born in Casablanca to Moroccan parents. When her family moved to Israel from Morocco with dark skin, dark eyes, different food and cultural practice, they were treated like second-class citizens by the Eastern European Jews who tried to stop them disembarking. Also at the funeral was a non-Jewish friend who leads workshops in synagogues for Jewish children during the festivals. She knows more about Jewish culture and tradition than many in-name only Jews. My niece-in-law is Turkish, my mother's friend from Shanghai. And then there's my goddaughter with an Ashkenazi white mother and a black Jamaican Jewish father. When she went to Israel a few years ago, she experienced racism from people who did not acknowledge her Jewish identity, only seeing the color of her skin. At one point after the funeral, when the rabbi was reciting something to me, a cousin turned to him and berated him for slipping into an Ashkenazi rhythm. Acceptance of other Jewish traditions and cultures, respecting that we have individual practices, is a way forward for the religion and culture if it is to survive. I still don't know what I think about Jewish multiculturalism or what it means to be a Jew. I only know that I'm a bit of everything: Jewish, gay, south of the river dweller, writer, runner, wife, student, teacher, friend, and so much more. And all of that feeds into my culture. When people ask me where I'm from, which they do quite often, I'm often asked if am I French, am I South American? I prefer to be asked, who do I come from? There's a poem I use in my work with the Royal Literary Fund by Dean Atter called I Come From. I come from the rivers Hooghly and Thames, the Euphrates and Tigris, north and south, east and west. Who do you come from? Thank you.
Shelley, thank you so much for that. Our final speaker tonight is Will Self, the author of many novels and works of non-fiction, including How the Dead Live, which was shortlisted for the Whitbread Novel of the Year, The Butt, winner of the Bollinger Everyman Woodhouse Prize for Comic Fiction, and Umbrella, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. His latest work is Why Read? Selected Writings 2001 to 2021. Will, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to all the participants this evening, and in particular, condolences to Shelley. That's a heavy loss. I was fascinated to listen to what everybody said. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Jew. But sometimes I get asked about my heritage, and I say that my mother was a Jew. And then my interlocutors, if they're English Gentiles, will invariably say, well, you're a Jew then. And I'll say to them, no, I'm not. I'm not a Jew. You wouldn't say to a person who had a Chinese mother that they were Chinese. You wouldn't say to somebody who had a black mother and a white father that they were necessarily black. Why do you say to me that I have to be Jewish? And they say, because that's what the Jews say. In that kind of deference to the idea that they will take the role of enforcing the matrilineal nature of Jewishness, I don't think that the English Gentiles are being in some way particularly sensitive culturally to Jews. On the contrary, I think that beneath it lies a tiny little old taint of anti-Semitism, as usual. Why? I know for two reasons. One is, whenever I tell people, having told them I'm not a Jew, though I'm of Jewish heritage, they look like this, they look at me sideways, they sort of cock their heads like this, and look at my nose. They look at my face, they look at the fact that I have dark olive skin. And they're confirmed in their prejudice. Because for them, deferring to the Jewish matrilineal inheritance is a form of condescension, in fact. And it's a form of reinforcing the particular taint, it seems to me, of anti-Semitism, which is that for racists, Black people are not exactly an enemy. They're actually conceived of by racists as an underclass at best, and in some cases as non-human. And for sexists and misogynists, women are inferiors. But for the anti-Semite, the Jew is feared as an enemy. And even a tiny, tiny particle of anti-Semitism introduces that fear. So I don't really identify as a Jew, except sometimes I do. Sometimes when I have to, I do. When I need to stand up and be counted. I'm not circumcised. I'm not bar mitzvahed. I have no Yiddish, no Hebrew. There were no Jewish festivals kept in our house. My mother would say, don't say anything about being Jewish. We pass. I think she was deluding herself. She didn't really pass. If she did, she passed a little bit because despite the thing some Gentiles might look at in profile and see having a particularly hawkish bent, despite the olive skin that I share with her, she was American. And even though she was a nice Jewish girl from Queens, she was exotic enough in the North London of the early 1960s to be American first. And maybe her Jewishness hid behind that. The other thing was, we were surrounded by English Jews who lived in the Hampstead Garden suburb in East Finchley in North London, around where we were. And my mother, I wouldn't go so far as to say she had contempt, but she didn't have much to say about the English Jews who surrounded us. She said, she once quoted G.K. Chesterton, a famous anti-Semite, to me. Chesterton said, the Jews are like everyone else, but more so. What would you say of English Jews? That they're like the English, but more so. And certainly compared to my mother, who was flamboyant, outspoken, and almost sort of stereotypic New York wiseacre, the English Jews who lived around us did seem slightly colorless, slightly like the English, but more so. And I had, I suppose, quite a bit to do with them, but I didn't feel any huge affinity with them. I didn't feel any great draw to Judaism. My father seemed completely indifferent to all of this. He was English, his heritage had its own peculiarities. It wasn't a big deal. The central problem, the central issue of Jewishness would come to the fore in our house because my parents argued constantly, fought constantly, despite which my father had in fact been a conscientious objector during the Second World War. And my mother, who was not short of using the most awful calumnies and libels when she was aroused, would, in front of us, her children and his children, accuse my father of having been a kind of, I don't know, accomplice before the fact of the Holocaust. because he wouldn't fight in the Second War. And my father would protest. We knew very little about it. And my mother, and also point out that he was 20 when he was called up. And my mother was having none of it, which is fairly grotesque. My mother, and you may begin to think at this stage that I'm revealing myself as being fairly typically Jewish mother's son. My mother also was keen to de-racialize the idea of Jewishness. The Holocaust had been predicated on a racial distinction. In some ways, before the Holocaust, Jews weren't as racialized as they subsequently became. My mother wanted to reverse this. She spoke of the Falashas in Ethiopia. She would say, there are Jews in India, there are Jews in Goa, there are Jews in Malaysia. And for the most part, many of them look like the host populations. I didn't know whether this was the case or not. I was just a child. All I knew was that the Jewishness was something we didn't want to go on about. Occasionally, she'd crack, she'd proclaim that all the most intelligent and cultured people in the world were Jews, Marx, Freud, Einstein, etc. And we'd get in the car, go to Golders Green, to Bloom's Delicatessen, and eat salt beef sandwiches. That was it. She died when I was relatively young, in my early 20s. And with her, what Jewish connection there was died as well. Throughout my adult life, I've only felt Jewish, and this is to pick up on something that Shelley was saying, I've only felt Jewish in the presence of anti-Semitism. That's what has activated my sense of belonging, no matter how attenuated it might be. I felt Jewish when the boss of one of the first jobs I had, which was working for a contract publishing company, and I wanted to go and pitch to Tesco's. He said to me, you don't want to go over there, Will, they're all Yids. Then I felt Jewish. I felt Jewish when anybody made an anti-Semitic remark, which was fairly often still in the 1980s. And that kept my Jewish identity alive. But I think like a lot of, not just secular, but half Jews like me maybe, or Jews who are in some sense disaffected, I came to view the situation in Israel as poisonous in some senses, just poisonous, just toxic, and to be very, very upset by what was going on with the Israeli state. And after Operation Cast Lead, when the IDF went back into Lebanon in 2009, I think it was 2009, might have been 2011, I resigned my Jewishness publicly in an article in the Evening Standard. Not that I felt that the kind of Sabra elite in Israel were likely to notice this at all. It was really aimed at liberal Jews here in the UK, who, as I saw, as apologists for the IDF and by extension, the Zionist bent in the Israeli government. I've now reassumed my Jewishness. Here I am. Here I am. I've reassumed my Jewishness. And why have I reassumed my Jewishness? Because my brother's in-law's carer, when he was dying a year and a half ago, quite casually said she was the carer he really liked, the one that danced in front of him, that kept him having any skin in the game of life. The carer said, en passant, you know, some people say that Hitler was right. And when I double took and said, what do you mean? She said, well, you know, he was just acting before the Jews became the controllers of the world media that they are today. That made me feel quite Jewish. I was quite ashamed that I didn't push back hard against her. I didn't push back hard against her because she was black. And the new anti-Semitism that is abroad in this country is different. It's different to the good old-fashioned English anti-Semitism. You know, my mother would say, in America, they hate you because you're black, you're a woman, or a Jew. Here, they hate you personally, and you only happen incidentally to be black, a woman, or a Jew. I don't really believe in the idea of multiculturalism at all. Culture is a vector, and vectors only usually go in one direction. They carry practices, beliefs, attitudes, philosophies from the present into the future. If many different kinds of communities with different cultural attributes coexist, it's because of the tolerance of a dominant culture, or not. It's not because there's some saintly world government waiting for us ahead of the line. That's not going to happen. And the evidence that that's not going to happen is how the several communities in this country are starting to jostle against each other, like some kind of perverted introjection of the British martial races policy. Narcissisms of small differences between the oppressed, who passes, who's looked at sideways and who isn't, doesn't have to be looked at sideways because they have a black face, and so on and so forth. The evidence is, I'm sad to say, all around us in the rising prejudice towards Jews, and in a rising prejudice that is, of course, reintroducing the racialized conception of what it is to be Jewish. Of course, the irony for me is that when I did get my DNA done, and of course you do inherit many more of your genes from your mother than your father, I discovered that yes, of course, I'm 3/4 Jewish genetically, not just a half. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. And thank you to all of our brilliant speakers tonight, Simon, Nadine, Keith, Shelley, and Will. It's been a pleasure to be in your company for the last hour and to hear your stories and such insights from you all. And thank you again to WritersMosaic for making this evening possible. Coming up next week, we have a 5x15 on Monday evening featuring Thomas Halliday, author of the highly acclaimed book Other Lands, along with the award-winning author Patrick Radden-Keith, Dean Burnett, Suzanne Rack and Kirsty Sedgman. It's not to be missed, and we hope to see you again. Thank you and good night.